All right. So hi, everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the Healing-Centered Engagement webinar with Jesse Heffernan from Helios Recovery Services of Wisconsin. My name is Maisha Zakrevsky. I'm the Learning Experience Team Manager with CCAR's Training Department, and I thank you all for being here today for this part 2. We had such great discussion and engagement yesterday. I can't wait to see what Jesse has in store for us today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic over to Jesse.
All right, thank you so much, Maisha, and welcome back, everyone. So glad that you made it. In addition to, I think, Maisha, with the recording links that you send out, I'm going to send you a few links as well to some articles and blogs in the agenda piece as well, just so folks can, if you're interested in getting more engaged with this, you certainly can. Again, I don't want to. I'm not getting paid by Flourish Agenda to plug their training, but I certainly recommend, if healing-centered engagement is something that calls to you, I highly recommend their certification process. I've not in my career been a fan of letters after my last name for various reasons, and so the only two kind of ones I put on there now are RCP and then Healing-Centered Engagement Practitioner. And those are the ones that I just feel like it was more about what was meaningful to me and like my journey than it was about like what other people saw as like the thing to have or what was important kind of a thing. So that's my story. I'm going to stick to it. So just it's just a reminder from some of the things I'm going to do, some kind of check-in pieces, so a little bit of review from yesterday, and then go into the rest of the modules. Randy just Elmoed me. So again, creating a courageous space encourages dialogue, recognizing the difference in holding each person accountable to do the work of sharing experiences and coming to new understandings. Again, it's about, for me, it's places to learn aren't necessarily just places where I can feel just safe and just stay comfortable and maintain the status quo or my own belief systems about things. I believe trainings are meant to be engaging and challenging. And so I'm hoping that this is a space where people can be courageous to step outside of those things and, to be able to look at, my own belief systems and say, like, are these fitting anymore? Do these align with all the other efforts that I have going on, right? And so I really didn't hear too much yesterday from folks if they needed anything additionally to feel supported or challenged during this training, but I just want to throw that back out there and see if there is anything that folks need. Am I sharing my screen? No, I'm just talking like I'm sharing my screen. That's hilarious. Oh my gosh. Such a professional. I was like, you're all reading this with me, right? And no one said anything. That's why I need a producer, a co-facilitator to keep me.
Randy, what are you doing back there?
I was never offered the position.
I've been Elmoed twice.
And I'm not sure if I would have accepted it anyways, but anyway.
Right, great. You can probably hopefully see the screen now. And again, if anybody needs anything additionally, feel free to put it in the chat box now or throughout the course of this training. Again, be like, oh, I need this or this space, right? I think it's really important that for me as a coach and a trainer to continuously invite folks to ask for what they need, even if that's like partway through something and what they might need is contrary to what they originally asked for, right? Because we know that folks change. Learning objectives, key differences between healing-centered engagement and trauma-informed approaches. And so again, we covered a lot of those things yesterday, just kind of like, we teed up that, recovery coaching is trauma-informed, but it may not be the best language that fits for us, right? Because it's got like that, what do I want to say? Trauma-informed care is like a label wrapped in a lab coat, right? And a lot of times people feel it's a little too clinical or outside of our lane, right? And so HCE is very similar to that, but it again kind of isn't more in our scope. Ways to improve strategies and outcomes of recoveries and understand appreciative inquiry and peer client participation and how they relate to healing-centered engagement. Any questions from yesterday before I move forward? Thoughts, comments, aha moments? Sometimes things percolate a little bit. Ruth.
Thank you, Jesse, and good afternoon, everybody. Great to be back here today. The entire time yesterday really sat so very well with me, Jesse. You know, sort of, and Meisha will confirm that I've been raving about it in email. But one of the most interesting pieces, just in terms of, you know, how I will be adapting some of this to my practice, has to do exactly with that idea of courageous spaces.
Mm-hmm.
I'm finding, I mean, I love the idea of working agreements. The working agreements is our collaborative model in action from minute one of an engagement. And I think that that's really important because it sets the scene of how we're doing, how we're going to be together. I think your courageous spaces idea builds that up a notch.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like it. I think that I think it speaks to a coaching engagement, as opposed to what we're seeing increasingly in the field, which is an agency-centered peer-client, agency-client relationship, where even broaching working agreements is very tough. So I just wanted to thank you for that. That's really sitting with me, and I'm looking forward to figuring out how I'm going to put this into practice, and most especially how I'm going to incorporate it into my training practice. Thank you.
Thank you. And I have to give credit where it's due. That courageous space concept was something I learned at Mobilize Recovery last year, the online version, from Mariel Huffnagel and someone she was co-presenting with. And when they offered it up, they just had this really fascinating and great like approach to setting some of these spaces up. And so like that again is one of those things where I borrowed and changed a little bit. There was some language that they had that I moved around a little bit. But I really like that concept too of like, I'm not here to feel, I'm not here to stay in my comfort zone, right? And so how do we create that space for folks? Stacy?
Sorry, I had to find my unmute. So one of the things that I kept thinking about and reflecting on, and I think this goes to maybe some of the comments that we were talking about yesterday as far as labels and assumptions, right? And which is why I so appreciate this healing centered, you know, this positive word for some of this stuff, because as soon as somebody hears trauma, right, there's already that negative connotation that goes along with it. And, you know, in some of the things that I was just reflecting about my own personal stuff that I've been through, not all trauma is necessarily going to affect people in the same way. Some people do have healthy coping mechanisms, and not everybody is going to need, or the expectation shouldn't be that everybody is going to need therapy or counseling, or is going to have, you know, an issue with addiction or whatever because of the things that we went through. And again, I just caution people to not impart some of that, you know, some of that information or some of that onto the people that we're coaching just because we've been given new language or given something to, you know, I feel like sometimes when people, and even myself, when I learn some of these things, I start trying to like check people into boxes or trying to figure out like, what are the things, and that's on me to manage my stuff and know that I shouldn't be doing that, you know, but I know that's how we do things. You know, you want to categorize. And so I just think that, again, going into this and having, you know, again, some language or some reference is always a good thing, and having a little bit more knowledge base. But again, not let that drive a conversation, or, you know, if somebody mentions something that happened to them, as a child or as an adult or whatever that it's coming up for them, asking them, well, do you want to do something about that? Do you want to explore with somebody further about that or whatever? And not making the jump to, oh my goodness, that must have been a traumatic experience for you. Let me get you some, I think we still have to let that person guide it, because everybody deals with trauma very differently. And we can't just assume that somebody who maybe experienced something is broken or needs to be fixed or, that kind of stuff. So.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think we go through a lot of that too in the RCA. We're just like managing our stuff, like you said, but like not projecting it, right? Like just because I was in a car accident and needed things and it still impacts me a certain way and you're in a car accident doesn't mean we're going to go through that all the way the same way. So thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Margaret?
I just wanted to say, Jesse, that I thoroughly enjoyed the webinar yesterday. And there were a couple of points that you made that really kind of stood in my head last night. Number one, using the term activated rather than triggered. I thought that was a wonderful distinction because I think we would all agree that triggered has been so overused, it almost has no meaning at sometimes. And also the distinction that you made on a trauma not being simply an individual experience, that it's collective, and also that there's culture within trauma within culture. Those points really just resonated very much with me. And I just want to thank you for all the research and time that you've done to put this presentation together. It's phenomenal. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a labor of love. It's been, again, like I just, grasp on, like, when there's new concepts and tools and ideas and then they come out there, it's just like, oh, this has got to get out there somehow, some way, right? It was, who was it that shared this with me? It was Brent Canode over from Portland. He posted it and I was just like, this is incredible, right? And then coincidentally, I was starting to work with this group called Lifehouse in Duluth, Minnesota. So I'd started using the article to train a little bit. And then they said, oh, we're going to go through the HCE training. And I got really offended. I'm like, someone else is doing HCE training? They're like, yeah, the people who created it offer a certification now. I'm like, oh, guess it's not. So I actually connected with them and I've shared this training with them and like it's actually been a really good relationship. So yeah, no, I've really enjoyed doing this. Just some reflection of yesterday. Again, we talked a little bit about, and again, in that context of trauma, we know that there's like acute trauma, the big things that happen to folks that we talk about maybe more often. And those things might make an individual, and they've made me maybe a little bit more susceptible to things that are kind of current, right? I think of them as like humming and white noise, like this failure to protect, attune, choose, and stay, right? Like some of those things just constantly are going on. And my activation or response to them varies, a lot of times depending upon my own self-care, right? Like some days I might be like resilience factors at like, 200%. And then like other days, like, nope, I'm just everything. I'm like a raw nerve, right? And reactionary to stuff. And I got to take a look at things. And it's because this stuff is still constantly humming, right? So we got that, and then this idea of moving from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement, expanding how we think about trauma and offering a more holistic approach, which of course we talk a lot about as recovery coaches and trainers, involving cultural, spirituality, civic action, and collective healing. So again, it brings it from that kind of micro or like individual sense all the way to the big A advocate, right, of what's going on in our communities. And again, a lot of this language parallels what we already see with RCOs, with recovery high schools, with all kinds of centers and places where people are healing and starting to engage a little bit. And again, so this is just to kind of mirror and reflect that I think that we've been doing this the whole time. We just have now new language for it. It views trauma, like you said, not simply as an individual isolated experience, but the ways in which healing and trauma are experienced collectively, right? So we talk a lot about, especially in the substance use disorder recovery space, like this many people overdose and this many things happen and these counties are having more problems, right? And it's like this barrage of data around like the collective pain that we might know differently than what other people, someone like that hasn't been as close to this or doesn't want to be as close to this might hear those numbers and be like, oh, that sucks, right? Moving on. It's almost like a constant for us sometimes, right? And so the other side of that, when we look at HCE, is also talking about like how our healing needs to be collective and how we do that through our centers, through our individual coaching and through our training as well, right? And to get that information out there. And I think that's why it's so great to see and hear like data and powerful stories from individuals and how their lives were lifted up and saved and all these things that happen through centers and high schools and individuals, right? Because again, it allows us to see collective healing taking place at the same time. And simply put, a healing-centered approach is strength-based, right? So it's moving even from the trauma-informed care idea of like what happened to you to what's right with you, right? Starting with the strengths. And if someone, doesn't necessarily know how to do like a strengths assessment, we can help them with that, right? Here's internal and external stuff that we call recovery capital, right? And even though you may think you don't have a lot, in reality, there is a whole lot of external resources, right? So we can help them build those strengths and advance as a collective view of healing. And again, recentering culture as a central feature in well-being. And we know, again, like culture just isn't about like maybe my own kind of like, what would you say, like historical, racial, ethnic culture, but it can mean a whole lot of things, right? It can mean like the culture within the recovery community. There's conference culture, right? Where you get crappy coffee and all your pens for the year, right? Like that's a culture that we haven't had for a little bit. But, again, like it's this introduction into what a collective healing and a collective culture could look like for individuals. And so we're going to go into a little bit more of like what it means to actually do these things and like where we practice HCE. And then we're going to go into looking at kind of like a version of not just motivational interviewing, but it's something called appreciative inquiry and then some peer participation stuff as well. So the 4 key elements of healing-centered engagement is that it's political rather than clinical. And that raised some great flags for me at first when I saw that, because I think of like, social justice engagement, civic engagement and things like that, but it even changes it a little bit from there. And again, it moves it from that realm of like the clinical over into something that might be more comfortable in our lane. Culturally grounded views healings as the restoration of identity. Asset driven focuses on well-being we want rather than the symptoms we want to suppress, right? So it's not just about symptom repression, right? It's about looking at holistic goals and big picture kind of stuff as well. And supports providers in their own healing. So we also have to do the self-care piece. We have to look at ourselves in the context of all of this and what this means, right? Our healing too is contingent on our culture in our communities as well, right? So where is that place for all of us? So the first one, communities and individuals who experience trauma are agents in restoring their own well-being. Healing is found in an awareness and actions that address the conditions that created the trauma in the first place. So when we talk about this being political rather than clinical, right? We're looking at individuals. And so for me, when I started getting engaged at a political level, right? It came out and I've come to believe for myself, like a lot of times the work I do is almost this like reflection of my old stuff, my past traumas, and I'm trying to create a world where those things don't happen anymore, right? I had a minister friend of mine, we were out disc golfing one day, and I was just sharing about the work and the stuff that I was doing at Harmony Cafe, and he's like, well, what was the wound in which you found your ministry? And so I had a big aversion to the word ministry. It's like, don't you say that to me. But what he meant was, right, like what was the pain that was kind of the doorway to go into the work that I was doing, right? And I think a lot of times that's where folks come into a lot of this, right? There's a pain, I need to change something in the world, I need to fix something in the world, and I'm going to use either current skills and assets to do that and influence that, or I'm going to learn them, right? And so a lot of times that well-being or that healing process comes from somewhat changing the outside world, but also being aware of where that comes from for ourselves. And then the actions that address the conditions that created the trauma in the first place, I think that we're starting to see more and more and more of that, right? We're starting to see, and again, like, it's nice that I can just throw out like recovery coach or CCAR like training terms, and you're all like, just pick it up with me. I don't have to explain it. So when we go into like iatrogenic harm, right? And we think about like, what were the harms that have been done and maybe even currently being done that still continue to like, harm the recovery community, right? What are some of those things that still continue to like why are we fighting for, like, even there's a group of folks, just looking for 10% of set aside money from substance abuse block grants, right? Like 10%, and what's always fascinating to me is I go to communities and counties and I train and I talk about recovery coaching, and I'll go in there and say, listen, I'm a person in long-term recovery. I'm going to be hanging out in your community tonight and I want to go hang out with people in recovery. Where do I go? Exactly. It's just like crickets, right? And then I say, so your expectation is that people will go through their 1, 2, 3, 10 episodes of treatment, and then they just got to figure it out, right? We just kind of let them go after that, right? We don't create the conditions. We don't create the support systems. We don't address the things that, will continue to perpetuate traumas, that will continue to perpetuate recidivism and reoccurrence of symptoms and all those kind of things, right? So the political side of this, I think, is what I've seen a lot of folks do, is they start building RCOs. They start advocating at local levels. They start advocating in policy levels, right? And I love the stories idea because, again, someone might say there's an AA meeting at the church tonight, and I go, well, 12 steps not my pathway, right? What then? And a lot of times people are like, there's more pathways. That's a whole other piece of it, right? But when we first get into this and looking at those political pieces and looking at that kind of side of things too, right? Like just knowing this is political rather than clinical. And part of our work, and I believe for me in the recovery field, is social justice and its interconnections with other social justice issues, like was mentioned yesterday, right? For all those things to thrive. Any comments about this first kind of principle of being political rather than clinical, things that come up for you? All right, moving on. Culturally grounded. So culture offers a shared experience, community, and sense of belonging. Healing is experienced collectively, shaped by shared identities such as race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, and healing-centered engagement is a result of building a healthy identity and sense of belonging, right? So again, like really going into those understandings of like folks might say, and they have said, like, well, I don't understand my identity. I don't understand even what culture I have, right? And for some folks, like just experiencing recovery culture is like the first thing for them, where they start to form identities, where they start to form ideas of how they're going to then impact, right, their community, right? And a lot of times for folks, that first invitation to those things is their recovery identity. It starts to develop through service work, right? And how they start to heal the community, right? And so when we talk about collective healing, think about the collective healing that happens in recovery support groups themselves, right? Within 12-step communities that there's such a strong bond in a lot of these communities, and they're all kind of collectively healing. And we also know then there's like even, collective kind of grief at times too, when someone leaves and things like that, right? And then the resilience of the community needs to continuously step up and do those kind of things, right? But for a lot of folks too, in the kind of basis of this whole idea of healing-centered engagement, when Dr. Ginwright wrote this, right, he was, again, working with, young Black males in inner city Oakland and talking about like, how do they get reacquainted with their own culture, and how do they get reacquainted with their own sense of healing within their families and within those systems, right? And similarly, the work that I'm doing with a First Nations group here in Wisconsin, the Oneida Nation, we're talking about building recovery support systems for organizations. And the biggest thing that they're like, we need to incorporate a way for people to get connected to their culture, to their language, to their stories and things like that, right? And so I'm working very closely with their cultural heritage program as to how they're going to infuse those things into this healing piece. And at the end of, the end of August, they're bringing in Don Coyes, right? They're going to do like a big 3-day healing ceremony, right? Because they know that something like that and bringing in the cultural elements of these things is going to help that collective healing start to happen within their community, right? And they're opening up a new RCO and they're doing all this stuff around it, right? They're really looking at a cultural approach to the healing and the recovery of their community. Thoughts, comments, questions around culturally grounded aspects of healing-centered engagement, things that come up for you, things that you've experienced from other centers, RCOs, so on. Neetha?
It's just interesting. So I've had a few conversations. I had a conversation even last night with somebody who works within the drug services in the UK. And since the recent Gabor Mate movie came out and a lot of people watched it, we've just kind of noticed, and he definitely has noticed within his role, that a lot of people are saying, right, my addiction was caused by trauma, but I don't know what that trauma was.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's kind of like what I'm seeing here is a way to have conversations with people about healing,
Mm-hmm.
even if they feel like, you know, they can't identify a trauma that they think might be there because of the information they've heard. And just that community piece is just so missing, you know, and how do we create healing-centered engagement when we're still trying to figure out how to create some recovery engagement with some people? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's interesting though, really. Yeah.
And what, you know, like I shared yesterday, like I didn't know the extent of my own trauma until 10 years in recovery.
That's it.
Right. And so if someone like, I mean, I could be like, oh yeah, like there was some messed up stuff that happened, but I don't remember all of it. And like, again, trauma-informed care allowed me to start exploring some of those dimensions. And but again, like that can happen in so many different ways for folks, right? And I think the big thing here too is to not mistake trauma bonding, as I've heard it called, with collective healing, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm not just perpetuating my own wounds. I'm not just, you know, war storying. I'm not just like sharing my trauma for the sake of sharing my trauma, right? So again, that shift even in this, right? Like I haven't watched the movie yet, and I've watched people's reactions to Gabor Mate's pieces around trauma and like how, again, focused it becomes on the deficits rather than the healing.
Yeah.
Right. And so I'm waiting for part 2 from him. Like,
yeah.
I get it. I get the realm of hungry ghosts. I get all those concepts and I know them.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the elevation piece then, right? We just can't stay in the deficit of all that. Ruth, do you have a comment?
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff, Jesse. I moved to comment by something Nathan said. I am not my trauma, and my trauma is not my identity. My trauma may be part of my story. And one of the most challenging things was pointed out to me a long time ago, you know, Ruth, you may never know your story. You may never know what happened to you, but that does not preclude healing. And I think that what's important about that is that clinical focus is all about the goddamn story. What happened to you? Why did this happen to you? Yada yada. And I may not be able to ever access that information. I can still heal. And it is not my identity. So what I love about when we move on to talk about, all right, then what about identity? And your definition of recovery as identity is the restoration, or recovery is the restoration of identity. I really like that. Because that's exactly, you know, sort of how I've experienced it. And, you know, sort of, and and I still don't know any more about my story than I ever did.
Yeah.
And how I get to restoring my identity has to do with the kinds of identification that you're talking about on this slide.
Mhm.
And the single most significant skill that I was taught in the rooms was how to identify,
Mhm.
how to hear my story from people whose details were completely different from me. And yet to be able to hear the essence there that connected with me.
Mhm.
And, you know, so I think that your framing here is not only directly on point, but shows us a way for moving forward with the healing piece.
Mhm.
Making those identifications, you've got a nice list on the slide here, and connecting into those communities,
Mhm.
so that I have that support and those resources and that recovery capital.
Mhm.
This is lovely stuff, Jesse. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and again, like that last one there for me is like healing centered engagement is the result of building a healthy identity and sense of belonging. And again, it's not predetermining what healthy identity means, right? It's just saying like we're building it over the course of time. And I think as a coach, that's what I'm able to help people do, is like help them build identity, right? And what that means for them, and try out things and look at options and look at all these different things they may not have seen before. And then the connection to their pathway of recovery, whatever that is, and develop belonging, right? Like, I think for a long time, just knowing that I belong to something was just so powerful in and of itself, right? And then, you know, when belonging was gone, or when I feel like I don't belong, then there's a lot of like activation for me, right? Like when I feel like I'm not part of the club anymore, like when I'm not involved with something, right? Then it's like a little bit more heightened, right? Then I question identity, then I question healing, right? And so it's this constant, I believe, like ebb and flow of looking at these things and finding these pieces for folks and helping with those things. Thank you for that feedback. Asset driven. So again, we've talked a lot about strength based. Focuses on the well-being we want rather than the symptoms we want to suppress, right? So again, we talked about focusing on potential rather than pathology. I'm not necessarily looking at like pushing down, like let's just get rid of your negative behaviors. Let's just like, and one thing in total personal belief system, right? Like abandoning this idea for me, like there's some addict like talking to me in the back of my head has really been helpful for me, right? Or I've got two of them on my shoulder and like one's, and I'm like, because I understand the brain disease now, I understand those concepts of reoccurrence, right? And I understand there's certain symptoms that come with this disease, right? And so when I'm able to focus on the well-being that I want and be able to envision that, we're going to talk a little bit about that too in the appreciative inquiry piece. It's not to say that focusing on well-being is necessarily going to completely like heal and eradicate symptoms, right? But it can certainly help, right? Positive mindset, focusing on those things. And part of that journey then is looking at maybe, you know, like, well, what were the things that caused symptoms in the first place? Do I need to go back and look at some stuff, right? Asset-driven strategy acknowledges that people are much more than the worst thing that happened to them, right? Much more than the worst thing. And so similarly, when, you know, we've made this shift to person first language as like, you know, not necessarily just looking at someone as their diagnosis, this is also suggesting we're not just looking at someone as their trauma or the worst thing that happened to them, right? And it builds on their experiences, knowledge, skills, curiosity as positive traits to be enhanced, right? Again, all this language for me just, you know, resonates what we learn in recovery coaching training and in different kind of areas like that, right? But offers like kind of like a different framework for it, if you will. Thoughts on asset-driven principle for HCE? John?
Yeah, I'm sort of catching up, or my processing is looking at this slide and considering the last slide, and something that I've been sort of concerned about for a while now is this pushing of, as Neetha said, you know, I'm an addict, so I must have trauma. Where is my trauma? You know, this complete focus on I couldn't possibly be where I am today unless I had trauma, and I need to find that trauma. And so the stuff that you're talking about, Jesse, in the last, you know, I utterly love it. It really resonates with me. And I know if I was in active alcoholism, or when I was in active alcoholism, my mind would magnify trauma and difficult situations, and they would empower my addiction. You know, I would, you know, if you had my life, you'd drink too, type of thing. And I know in recovery, looking back at the traumas that I had when I was in active alcoholism, I thoroughly believe that if I wasn't drinking, A, they wouldn't have happened, but B, if they did happen and I was sober, they would not have the power that my addiction gave to it. And one of the things that I did some writing, and one of the books talks about a lady who, during her active alcoholism, one of the things that she talked about was how terrible her mum was. Her mother would never ever let her wear shoes. She had no shoes as a child, and that's why her feet were terrible. She had terrible feet. And she got into recovery and rebuilt her community and her relationship with her mother and family. And when her mother got out her childhood photos, she had shoes on in every photo. So that sort of gave me an indicator that during active addiction, some of us, obviously not all of us because it's complicated, but some of us can focus on a trauma that wasn't even real. And use it and empower it, and you know, and give it energy. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. But you know, what you're talking about now is I think beautiful and a breath of fresh air and well needed.
Yeah, I can understand that, and I can think of the times that I've spent in recovery fellowships and where my own need to like share the pain, or like I had to be, again, like my pain and my trauma was some kind of qualifier to be a part of something, right? And then there would be comparisons, and then there would be, making it bigger than what it was maybe, and all these other things, right? And again, like it was because it was like I had to be in so much pain, or I had to do all this stuff in order to be a part of a community, in order to belong, right? And there's nowhere that it says in any book anywhere, as far as I've seen, unless you've got 5 of the aces or at least 6 or 7, then you can come to our meeting, right? Or you can be a part of our club, right? No one's checking my trauma at the door, gratefully. What they are saying is that if you want to stop using, if you want to stop doing these things, regardless of who you are, come in, go through some kind of process and look at the healing. And I think, again, this is kind of like some of that stuff that it's been trying to say, but there's been some distortion of it, right? And maybe that's just like human pieces of it, of just wanting to focus in on the worst thing that happened to me, right? So yeah, like again, like as we move into this asset-driven piece, and the folks that I've worked with, like when I sit down with recoveries and just try to do more asset mapping than anything else, like it's like a distorted experience for them, right? Like I'm not here to talk about that. I want to talk about all the crap that happened, right? And it's like, well, not my lane. And 2, like, we'll get there, right? We'll get there. Let's look at what you've got, kind of a thing. So, and I again like this piece about curiosity as positive traits to be enhanced, right? Like, again, people come to us for a reason. People attend trainings for a reason. They're trying to learn and figure something out, right? And so this, to me, again, is another thing that we can help them focus on. So the last one is supporting providers with their own healing. And I know in a number of trainings, we talk about self-care. There's been multiple trainings around like vicarious trauma, secondhand trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue, whatever the new label is this month, right? It boils down to taking care of myself, right? It's got to be done, you know? And so knowing like, I need to be part of the healing process, like that quote yesterday, right? If you're here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you realize that our liberation is bound together, then we can work together, right? Part of that is saying like, I'm part of the group and the collective healing that needs to happen too. I'm not separate from it. And I think, again, there's a lot of different places and paradigms that happen where there's like this, you know, I've worked with communities that have been kind of paternalized in a sense, right? So you'll get funders or agencies or big corporations that say like, we can come in and we can help you fix this stuff, right? And kind of, again, like impart their wisdom and stuff like that, or people with like a lot of experience in this field, right? Like saying like, you know, it's that they don't necessarily need to be doing things themselves, or you know, there's again like this distorted experience of the healing process, that it only needs to happen for people that are still in their trauma or the first few years of recovery or so on and so forth, right? It's critical, right, in supporting other people's well-being, that we support our own as well. And you know, I'm grateful that, you know, in my journey, like even things like today, being able to get back to a meeting and you know, doing something physical, like this last year has been especially difficult for a lot of folks, right? In being able to heal and being able to connect and being able to do the things that are need to be done, right? But one of the more fascinating aspects I loved about the recovery community is last March and April, like we were set up, right? We already knew what we needed to do to deal with difficult situations, right? So it was just like, oh, well, I just got to do what I keep on doing, but just on Zoom now. Okay, fine, right? And then there's folks that I know that aren't in recovery, and just how much they struggled, right? Where do I get this outlets for things, and how to like a lot of distractions were removed from people, baseball and kind of like outdoor things, right? And so they were left with their own feelings. They were left with their own stuff. They were left with their own trying to figure all this stuff out, right? And providers as well, right? When providers had to position themselves and figure out how they were going to provide stuff, there was some time where they weren't doing it. And I think it raised a mirror for a lot of folks, like, oh, I got to look at my own stuff and all of this. I got to work on some self-care and all of this, right? And if, again, like I don't want to, you know, kind of silver line the situation, because I know there's been a lot of grief and a lot of things that have happened. Yeah, spending 5 years incarcerated, staying home was a breeze. And the fact that people would compare it to prison, like they knew, it's like, is it though? Do you ever seen that episode of The Office with Prison Mike? What's the worst part about prison, Mike? It's the Dementors. Never mind. You got to watch the show. So thoughts on how providers and your own healing, your own experience, what this means for you, how you fill up your own cup, right? How this entangles into healing-centered engagement for you. I used to hear a lot in rooms, right, of providers and fellowship meetings, like it's all about finding balance, right? It's all about like, and the metaphors of like, I got to put a little bit of sand into each one of the scales and so on and so forth. Like there was some kind of magic formula that one day my life would be a complete balance. And it felt like it was this thing, kind of like always looking forward to the destination and not looking at the journey, right? This conversation reminds me to work on me. Good. Go fishing. And and I've had to like change my own language, right? So yesterday, right, like that conversation about attunement, right? Like I've had to attune to my own needs as well, right? So it's not about perfect balance, because that's just the thing, right? That's like some motivational poster or some TED talk that I'll never listen to. But equilibrium, right? Equilibrium is the ability to have, the ability to stand up and walk through something, right? When there's a lot of different things going on, right? And so equilibrium, I think, is a better concept and a better way to look at self-care. What do I need to have equilibrium in the current circumstances that I'm in, right? How do I self-attune to the things that I need right now, right? How do I ask for what I need, and how do I find those kind of things, rather than striving for this unrealistic idea of complete balance? And the other thing that I like to share, and then I'll get to Stacy, is that, I'm not a big sports ball fan, but there's a lot of people who are, and and maybe even for those of you who are football lovers, you could think of another analogy for this, but to get into the Hall of Fame for baseball, right? You only need like a 300% batting average, right? 300 to 400. So that's hitting like 3 or 4 out of every 10 times you're up, right? That's nowhere near 100%. And those people go on to be Hall of Famers, right? So where did this idea come from that we have to be batting 1,000%, right? Nobody does that, right? So when I think of like, all these different values and principles and self-care and equilibrium in my life, if I'm batting 40%, that's Hall of Fame, right? That's doing really well. And so to even as a provider and like reevaluate the expectations I've created for myself and for other people can be significantly healthy and helpful for me. If you only hit 2 out of 10, you suck, right? That must be a Minnesota Twins thing. I don't know. And so again, reevaluating what that looks like has been part of my own ongoing process. Stacy, comment?
Yeah, after I'm done chuckling at Randy's comment, it's just funny to me, because I feel like, when you were talking about like it's almost like pressure to do self-care to a certain extent or whatever, because I'm not doing it right if I'm not, if I don't have all these things. And as someone who basically, a lot of you already have known me for a while, like going to the gym at 5:45 every morning and going to that boot camp class, that was my self-care until I got COVID, until I ended up with this arrhythmia due to COVID. And it was like, no, you can't do that anymore. And I was like, what? What do you mean? Like, and trying to figure out like other things and how difficult that was, or no, well, you can go to the gym, you just can't do all of the stuff that I was used to doing, right? Like, well, just walk on a treadmill. Well, that doesn't work for me. So it took me a really long time to try to figure out. And I think sometimes we're so ingrained that we have to have like this perfect thing, like this, like somebody wants us to, well, what do you do for self-care? Like we need to have like this definition and this thing of, it's kind of like, well, how do you define recovery? And what are, all of these things. And I think it's okay to not be 100%. It's okay to not be 40%, that it's okay to not even know, or to just know that if I'm sitting quietly with my headphones in for 10 minutes, that's it for me today. And that's all I'm going to be able to do. And that's okay, but I think sometimes we, in this effort to kind of like, yes, of course I'm practicing self-care, we also kind of try to put ourselves out there in this way that we're doing so well at it, or we're doing all of these things to do it. And, and I think I even posted last week that I was doing all of these things to make sure I was, taking my meds at the right time every day. I had, this app telling me to take a drink of water. I had another app telling me to breathe or to stand up. And at one point I was like, enough. I wanted to throw my phone against the wall. I was like, leave me alone. I'm trying to get stuff done, but I think like sometimes we can overdo some of those things, and we really just have to listen to ourselves,
Yep.
and just what do we need in the moment, and it doesn't have to be anything more than just sitting or even knowing that about yourself or being attuned to that situation and saying, for right now, I need to not have my alarm going off about which is going to in about 8 minutes, by the way.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I think it echoes Ruth's point from earlier about like recovery, regardless of who you are, is about that identity, and that identity is the equilibrium and attuning to yourself, right? And it just, it just reminds me of when in the academy, when we do the recovery capital self-assessment, and everybody is so obsessed with the number and how it compares to someone else. And it's like, it's not about anybody else. It's not meant to be shared with someone else. You're not meant to like have it that way. It's about like, it's my capital, it's my assessment, and it's my ability to grow with inside of that, right? And again,
and it's okay if it's different every day.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
I could take that assessment in the morning and be like, yeah, I'm great. And then in that night, I'll be like, oh my God, I'm a mess, but that's that whole thing. Try not to position ourselves to an expectation or, but yeah, I totally get that.
Yeah. And just real quick, and I'll get to you, Ruth. I like your comment, Meisha, about like, it was difficult, in recovery, listening to myself because I didn't trust myself. And my question is then like, who taught me not to trust myself? Right? What were the messages like I got early in recovery? First thought wrong, run it by 45 people before you make a decision. Like there's this immediate deficit stigma put on people that you can't we're going to decide, whether or not you're putting pants on at what time, right? We're going to decide whether or not you're living up to the expectations of the program. We're going to decide. And there's all these arbitrary rules and guidelines that no one knows where they came from. There's no book that says you can't do these things or can't trust yourself early in recovery. But again, it's just like this perpetual deficit-driven trauma bonding experience where no, you can't trust yourself. Nope, we don't expect it. And then we wonder why, people don't stick around. We wonder why, people don't feel like they're being attuned to in the rooms of recovery. Ruth, go ahead.
I love this reframing, Jesse. The phrase self-care sets my teeth on edge, to be perfectly honest with you. And any time I listen to anybody whittering on about self-care, they're always talking about stuff like do some yoga. Well, I've given yoga a really fair go of it over several decades, and 100% of the time I fall asleep, and that's just the way it is. Now, that does not make me a bad person.
Right.
And it doesn't make me a person who is failing to thrive.
Mm-hmm.
So I love this idea of reframing as well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's a question, sort of the more I know myself, that's a question I become better and better at answering.
Mm-hmm.
So for me this afternoon, my well-being will be to take myself off to Central Library in Brooklyn, wonderful Art Deco building, a couple of blocks away from where I live, and wander around incredibly high ceilings and wander around the stacks that are open.
Mm.
And, sort of that supports every part of me in terms of my well-being for this afternoon. And in order for us to make this shift, whereby, sort of I say where my well-being is vested, to make that shift, we have to make the bigger picture shift of moving from a prescriptive approach
Mm-hmm.
to recognizing that actually, you know, Ruth, you're the expert of your own life.
Mm-hmm.
And Stacey is the expert in hers, and she'll be, you know, she'll be setting those alarms, be turning those alarms off as they serve her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think again that this is what is so attractive to me about what you're doing in this training, is that you're bringing us back through the process of reframing. You're bringing us back time and again to our core principles.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, sort of two experts in the conversation. You're the expert on your life, and I'm the expert on mine. Is an absolute core principle of our field, our lane.
Mm-hmm. And I think it extends to then when we talk about, like, I really love working with nonprofits and small groups and community agencies, and a lot of these same core principles thrive there as well, right? Like, you know, what's the well-being of an organization, and being able to look at, like, you know, of course I can just look at profit and loss statements and the numbers and the data and all those pieces, and those things matter, but also like the cultural feel, right? What's the self-care of the organization? Is it reassessing itself, right? And be able to attune to the needs both within, you know, the agency or organization itself, as well as the community simultaneously, right? And how are we, like, you know, I like the thinking of organizations as like they're their own type of living organism, right? And so we're constantly in this, like, what do you want to say, like looking at the ecosystem, right? And I like the idea of like recovery ecosystem, and what do those things mean, and how are things being fed? And sometimes it even means, like, kind of like what Stacy said, but like sometimes we got to throw the alarms out. Sometimes that just doesn't help the ecosystem thrive anymore, right? And so my own recovery experience is also an ecosystem that, you know, if you think about the world at large, there's a billion different kind of ecosystems, and they all have very specific needs. And the other thing that I love about them is that they're very resilient, right? And I remember early in recovery, I was really freaked out because I was experiencing like some depression, and I thought that, like, the amount of hallucinogens and narcotics I took, like, really messed some stuff up permanently. And one of my earlier counselors said to me, she's like, that's the thing about the brain and the body, is that it's extremely forgiving. And if you give it a little bit of time, it knows how to right itself. It knows how to realign, right? And it wasn't until probably like 15 years later that I heard this neuroscientist guy say the same thing. And that's when they started jumping into neuroplasticity and all those things that are way over my head. So again, when we talk about healing for ourselves as providers and attunement, it also then is a very good way to model that for other individuals, as that's also one of those components for recovery coaching. So this next piece here, I was going to do some groups, but I just want you to take 5 minutes. You can keep your cameras off or on, it's up to you. Generate 2 ways how you can apply from what we've learned so far yesterday and today, healing-centered engagement in your work as a recovery coach, and we'll get some replies when we come back. So we'll take about 5 minutes to do that. If you get done early, you can stand up and stretch, move around a little bit, but I'm just really curious to hear what came up for you and what you can apply in your work as a coach.
I gotta run.
Another minute. All right. So you're all welcome to, we can take some folks if they want to raise their hand and share what came up for them. You can type them in the chat box, or you can keep them for yourself. Any one of those options are okay. Would anyone like to start, provide some ideas of what things you can apply in your work as a recovery coach and or a trainer, or whatever your role is? John?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, yesterday's session left me thinking about a lot of things, and I think I'm already applying the ideas of yesterday's and today's session in all sorts of ways. I think I'm undergoing a big expansion of self, so I can't really put that into words yet. But I was thinking about dancing with discord, and how I could be better at that and less judgmental of that, with the focus on wellness and like you've said, better attunement.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so trying to be in tune with people better, and understanding that that they are the experts, as Ruth said. Yeah. I also think about this, thought more about this organizational well-being, and since yesterday's session, I've remapped how I'm going to work next year. So so there was some personal knock-on, and now I think you've really reaffirmed, like I alluded to yesterday. I've been going through some traumatic issues with family and things. And one of the things that I was told about 4 days ago was that my recovery was crap. It was rubbish. I didn't know how to do recovery because I don't go out for coffee with my brother. And therefore, my interaction with people is my recovery is shot because I don't do that. And listening to what Stacey said, my comfort zone is a bit introverted. I don't like going to coffee shops and talking about stuff at depth when there's 20 or 30 people sat around me. And, I was struggling with that over the last few days. So personally, for me today, I think, do you know what? I am all right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm allowed to do my recovery as I'm doing it. And I engage with a lot of people that really, really love me. So, yeah.
Right on. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. And again, like it's interesting how these kind of blanket expectations of recovery, like if you're not doing enough meetings, if you're not, engaging with people enough, right? If you're not connected with enough people, right? Like it's some kind of pass fail system, right? Which it's not, and I think again, like that's what I love about, this type of training with the RCA and with other components of just like kind of blowing the whole thing out of the water. Just being like, is it though? Like, how about, like, I know some people, like my wife is an introvert. This last year has been incredible for her. She's like, I don't have to deal with people, the people I don't want to deal with. When I go out in the community, like, I'm just like, just leave me alone. And I'm like sitting here like sweating and panting. I'm like, I need to be around people. I need to be in the cafe and around people doing things. And so, like, she's like, welcome to my world. And I may have grown like some introvert tendencies over this last year, which is okay, right? Reframing. Other thoughts, things that came up for people that they can apply in their work as a coach or trainer or whatever that is for them. Go ahead, Margaret.
Jesse, I'm having a real hard time answering this question because I'm just not at that stage yet with the COVID, situation last year and part of this year.
Mhm.
I just was doing a lot of, soul searching. I had been taking care of some relatives that had been very ill and ultimately passed on. And I was just, thinking about, what do I want to do now when you're around older people, particularly those who have dementia, and you see, the memories they have of their life. I'm like, what memories, have I not yet created for my own life? And so I've just been doing a lot of self-care, which I feel safe enough to say that as a facilitator, at times I have been very embarrassed to facilitate that part of the RCA and other curriculums that CCAR has, because I would be, the worst example of it at in previous times in my life. But now I'm really trying to focus on that to really become, better at it and not for a sense of perfection, but as, just to be healthier in general about what are my needs before, trying to help a lot of other people. And that's been a big lesson, that I've been working on. And your course is really coming at the right time of asking these questions, because it's helping me to, further, look at, where I am. So once again, thank you very much. And I will try to think of how I can do it as a, integrate some of these things as a coach and as a facilitator. But right now, I'm just not there.
Right. And I guess I would invite you to think like you just did, right? Because part of a recovery coach is our own well-being and our own sense of discovery and changing. So when you say that, I'm like, cool, you've got some really good ones, right? Like that, because you are part of that as well, I believe, right? So I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
Neetha?
Oh, sorry. So I kind of reflected yesterday. I'd taken a few notes, and I just like, I get up early in the morning, and then this morning I was sitting there and I was thinking, I'm good, like there's no kind of real trauma. I'm me as a person, I'm good. And then somebody posted on Facebook, one of my friends, about how they were now an empty nester and that their kids had all left the nest and they were looking for their new journey, excited about the future. And I just thought, gosh, that's actually the bit that probably I need healing around, because the reality is my dreams of an empty nest and what I was going to do have drastically changed. And I am not saying I resent it or regret the decisions I've made to have an intergenerational family, but there's still some healing that really has to happen. Making time for my marriage became something that I realized through all of this that is part of that healing. When there's 5 people in one house, we don't take that time to go on a date and do things. Kind of the things I guess we automatically think about with an empty nest and what we're going to do, those have definitely changed. So kind of the things that stuck out to me this morning when I journaled were where you talked about safety and choice and collaboration and empowered. And it was just like, I'm okay with the safety bit. Some choices have disappeared, you know? So how do I put new choices in my life? How do I step into this new future, you know? And there are challenges in that, but there is healing for the lost things. And I hadn't thought about that before yesterday. You know, I hadn't framed it like that. And then the bit that's really jumped out to me when talking about providers having healing, it's just, you know, I remember speaking to them somebody and they said, I know we've been doing this recovery stuff wrong. And I'm kind of leading this within an organization. Oh my God, how did I get it? And I just thought, gosh, there's some huge changes going on in England right now with the big drug paper that's come out of the government. And I thought, there might be people now that really have to reassess as providers what they've been doing through the models that now are being challenged and changed. And yeah, and it's about healing and accepting that they were the parameters that we had to work in that were there before, and there is change. So yeah, it's been really good. And so on a personal level, it's made me do a bit of self-discovery, and probably my journal got about 5.5 pages this morning to the usual one. Thank you very much for my little arthritic handwriting. But just, yeah, it's really interesting. And it's kind of like, how can we also use this, you know, to people who might have some of the things challenged that they've done before, to say, that's okay, we can heal through this. Yeah, so it's been really good. And I just, yeah, thank you. More self-discovery going on in my house.
Fantastic. Love it. Thank you. Stacy.
I think it's interesting that a couple of the comments that people are making have to do with the pandemic and COVID and how things have changed. And, you know, we're all part of this healing community that are coming out of this pandemic. And we've all walked through different pathways through it, right? And how we're surviving it and how we're getting over the other side of it is completely different for everybody. And so I think, you know, a lot of times we try to think about the ways that we have commonalities with the people that we're coaching and how we can, you know, have empathy and things. And we've all been through this. There is not one person on the single planet who didn't go through the pandemic, you know, but we all went through it completely differently. But even just as people are talking, we're still bringing it up, you know, we're still talking about it. We're still talking about the shift after the pandemic and what that looks like. And we're still managing some of those things. And so I think that when I look at this and I think about, you know, and Meisha, you said it about expectations and all of those things, is that sometimes, and I think this is where me as a recovery coach, I have to remember to not come in with for anybody, you know, like I can't have, you know, like I love the way Art Woodard always says, don't attach yourself to the outcome. You know, don't be disappointed if that person doesn't decide to go to the pathway that you suggested. Don't be upset if that person didn't decide to do, you know. And so I think we have to just be kind with ourselves, with the people that we're coaching, and not have expectations of anything. You know, sometimes, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, just showing up is maybe good enough, you know. And so I think, you know, 2 ways we can apply this. Well, we've been here now for 2 days. This, I know people don't look at professional development as self-care, the SC word. Ruth, thank you. I appreciate you saying that, because I feel like it's like such a, but I mean, but this is part of it. It's part of sharpening our skills and doing something for ourselves, for something that we see important, and so I appreciate everybody being completely vulnerable and sharing of themselves and what they're learning. And, I just really appreciated this. And I didn't know if I was going to be able to have the time to participate. I know time is always, and because I'm going to be out of the office for a bit, dealing with some things, I, really am glad that I took the time to sit and to do this, because I needed this. So thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Tito?
Hey, so my journey with healing-centered engagement. Yesterday, today, taking note, researching, kind of learning the differences of trauma-informed care and how healing-centered engagement are similar, but they're very different on so many different levels. And just kind of hearing the feedback from others, like the working agreements, right? Which makes sense. That makes sense to me. And then collective. What did I write down? Collective. I did some research behind this, because I thought to myself, like, yes, I work at a agency that does clinical work, though at the same time, sharing the benefits of recovery coaching and the similarities, though not like the same, if that makes any sense. Just based on my work with them is, individuals are more comfortable with recovery coaching than clinical from that perspective. So it's collective, I wrote it down. It's collective healing. So it hits home with me based on the concept of my lived experiences coming out of prison. One way of re-entering back into the community wasn't my way. I needed multiple ways to re-enter back into the community. So from what I'm gathering and what I'm learning, what I would take from this is the collective healing piece is one, and the what's the other one I just said? It was just shared yesterday, or was shared today as well. Not coming to mind, but the working agreements, right? Something like that.
Yeah, the courageous space.
Yes, that hits home on the level of being able to provide that type of support. But that's all I really have. I'm going to continue doing my research behind this. This really motivates me to move more in this direction than in trauma-informed care. Don't get me wrong, trauma-informed care is great, though this seems more holistic and less clinical.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for sharing those pieces. And again, hopefully these are some seeds that kind of continue to grow for folks. We're just going to cover, we got a little bit of time left. I'm just going to kind of do some intro to two concepts that could easily be like day-long trainings themselves. But this next one is something that, again, like when I think about working with folks, so again, what is social justice? This was supposed to be my thing, to be like, oh, we'll stop here and take a moment, but we're clearly past that. So appreciative inquiry, or AI, is a concept I was introduced to. That's, again, another one of those things that I think align very well with recovery coaching field and the recovery support services field. Typically, it's been something that's been used in, like, instead of doing SWOT analysis with organizations, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, it's more like, well, just look at the strengths of an organization and then look at the opportunities that you can build from there. But it also is sometimes used to be able to look at individuals, right, and work with them. And so to me, it's like an enhancement piece to walking with someone through their recovery wellness plan, or developing recovery capital and things like that. So again, it's about reinforcing relationships, culture, and common vision. And again, because I tend to think of like in strategic planning kind of a way, like this is good language for me when I'm trying to walk with someone through their whole process, right? So three-legged stool, that you've ever heard of that before in any of your trainings. But for this one in particular, it's appreciation, inquiry, and wholeness. Appreciate is to recognize the best in people or world around us, draws on strengths. Inquiry is to ask questions, be a student of the individual, right? The whole cycle invites participants to ask questions so they learn from one another. And again, it's a really great concept, especially like in an organizational structure, to like get a lot of collective buy-in and a lot of like movement to happen instead of like kind of like a stagnant kind of a process of change. And then wholeness encourages participation from the individual, knowing that the best ideas often emerge from unexpected places. And again, it's saying like, you know, there was this really great article that came out that said the idea of Maslow's hierarchy is flawed. And the concept was that like people are born whole, right? Rather than like, and they're born whole and self-actualized. It's not a place you got to get to, right? It's just moving through the journey of life to learn more about what that means for them, right? And I'll send that along with the additional materials. I encourage people to look at that. The 4 domains, and so again, when we think about recovery wellness planning with individuals, right? Discovery, we help recoveries explore the best of what is, identifying their strengths and sources of capital and vitality, right? Help them learn about what those are, discover those pieces. I really like that word discovery, you know, as we work with individuals. Dream, we help recoveries envision a future they really want, right? A future where they are fully engaged and successful around their core purpose and strategic objectives, right? We help them dream that. We're not providing the dream for them, right? We're saying, what does this look like for you in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? Again, this is just a lot of language we have, just new framework for it. Design, help leverage the best of what is and their visions for the future to co-design strategies, right? That's what we are. We're co-designers, co-creators in creating those things. Move the recovery's goals creatively and decisively in the right direction. And then destiny, help them put the strategies in action and revise as necessary, right? So that's again, like this approach of being like, we can move and attune and realign as needed. That's the flexibility of our field and the ability to really like, you know, move someone forward through their wellness planning is the ability of saying it's like, it's not set, even if it's written in pen, we can still throw it away and start over, right? So it's not this, you know, kind of like, what do I want to say? Like this kind of fundamentalist dogmatic attitude around like, you have to go through ABC to get D, right? We're just like, you might go through ABC, 1, 2, red, and Sunday, and that's what your recovery plan is, right? And that's okay. So again, just like I'll send some links on AI, and it's a fun, it's again, it's a really light and fun way to reframe and talk a little bit more about the things that we do. I'm not going to go through so much of this next part. I know CCAR is a CAPRIS certified organization, and there's some other organizations that are, but just the idea of peer participation and what that looks like in your organizations and your companies and things like that. And you know, what I really like about it is like you include people on every level, not just like on your advisory board or your community board, but like the people we serve are also involved in the day-to-day decisions. They're involved with the direction of the community and direction of the organization itself too, right? There are multiple individuals representing the peer voice in a process for taking it seriously. There was just some questions here. We won't go through these, but this is my other piece too. So I do a lot of strategic planning sessions for folks, right? And here's the thing, if an organization or a person's not willing to change their culture, strategy doesn't mean a damn thing, right? I will revisit, like I've had to go to the same place like multiple times and like strategic plan, but they're not willing to change the culture in which the plan is going to be implemented. They don't have the collective buy-in, they're not willing to look at assets, and they're not willing to look at healing, right? So when we help individuals and organizations change their culture, then we can develop strategy of what it's going to look like moving forward and have healing-centered engagement as a holistic practice. That's my time. That's what I got. End it with a bang, Ski.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse, for, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the sharing for a second. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you so much for bringing us this healing centered engagement workshop. So this offering is specifically for those within the International Association of Recovery Coach Professionals. So I'll be sending both links out for parts 1 and part 2 later on today, and I'll get those uploaded on YouTube and I'll send it out later today. And we just request that you use that for your personal coaching practice. And if you did enjoy what you saw today, I have been in talks with Jesse to possibly bring a 90-minute healing centered engagement workshop to all who want it. And at the end of September. So the date that we're looking at right now, it hasn't been written in stone, but I will send out some information about it. The date that we are looking at now is Friday, September 30th. So just, if you're interested in it will be more of a condensed version of this, but if you're interested in letting other people know about this opportunity, please tell them to kind of like save that date and look out for the communication regarding that. If you have been here, if you've been present for majority of both sessions, I will go ahead and mark you as attended in our lovely ProTrack system, and you will get the certificate of completion for having attended both trainings. Either way, you will receive both recordings. So thank you all for being here. And then if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me at maysha@ccar.us. That's M as in Mary, AY, S as in Sam, HA @ccar.us. Thank you.